Welcome. Well, I must say I'm delighted to welcome you tonight to a very special public forum debate here at Calgary Public Library. My name is Jerry Fawcett. I'm the Community Outreach Librarian who's responsible for government and legal information and civic literacy initiatives here at the library. Tonight's timely debate issue falls fast upon the recent federal election and is intended to provoke thoughtful insight into the issue of democratic reform. This debate focuses on the current system of first past the post in Canadian elections and is presented in partnership with Calgary Legal Guidance. To debate the question tonight, Calgary Public Library is extremely happy to welcome the Honourable Michelle Rempel, Member of Parliament for Calgary Nose Hill, and Elizabeth May, Member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands and Leader of the Green Party of Canada. I also extend a warm welcome to Dwayne Bratt, a professor and chair of policy studies at Mount Royal University. Dwayne is going to be tonight's moderator. And once again, I'm very pleased to welcome Larry Horeshi, Executive Director of Calgary Legal Guidance. Each of the Be It Resolved debates provides an opportunity to inform Calgarians through the conversations on hot-button topics of current interest and controversy. They're intended to stimulate thought, and we hope that's what will happen tonight. They also align directly with the Calgary Public Library strategic plan, which sets as a priority services and programs on those that make a difference to the community, including civic literacy. I wish to take a minute to remind everyone that the arguments our debaters will present on tonight's topic relate to their agreement to speak for or against the question. So I would remind you that they do not necessarily represent their personal views or values, and I ask that we all please be respectful of this. Following the main program, we invite you to mingle in the foyer for an opportunity to speak with each of the debaters and our moderator. I'd now like to turn the podium over to Larry Horeshi, Executive Director of Calgary Legal Guidance. Larry and his amazing team are responsible for organizing tonight's debate. Calgary Legal Guidance is also a major contributor for the library's public legal information programs by providing pro bono lawyers who present law at your library and families in the law programs here at Central and across our library system. So on behalf of Calgary Public Library, I sincerely acknowledge our long-standing collaborative partnership with Calgary Legal Guidance. Larry.
Thank you, Jerry, and I welcome everyone tonight. It is our honor and our pleasure to be co-hosting this evening's event. The Public Library and CLG have had a long history of partnership, and it is events like this that we believe can help inform people about the existence of our services, the wonderful people that we work with, our volunteers. At CLG, we have over 360 volunteer lawyers who provide free legal advice to people who cannot afford a lawyer and do not qualify for legal aid. It's an important role in our society. It's an important role for the disadvantaged to make sure there is equal access to justice. Information nights like tonight are also a way to help inform people about, as Jerry said, timely issues. And we continue to have further debates. There will be one coming in January, so if you are interested in further debates like this, please feel free to sign up after the debate. There is a sign-in sheet in the foyer, and there are little pieces of paper. If you cannot get to that sign-in sheet, please put your name on that and email, and we will simply contact you only for the purpose of further debates. Now, tonight's process is a little bit different than other debates. Given the size of the crowd, we knew we wouldn't be able to handle questions from the floor. It would be difficult for us with the time crunch we do have. And so what we've done is we've asked a partner of ours who participated in a previous debate, the University of Calgary Debate Club, to join us tonight, and they will be composing 2 questions for each of our debaters. They will be waiting until the initial opening statements are completed, then they will compose 2 questions for each debater. Those will be brought to the moderator, who will then read those questions following the rebuttals. I want to thank Christine McGeer and Laura Sadler from the University of Calgary Debate Club and their colleagues. Christina is a second-year student studying entrepreneurship at Haskayne, participated in formal debate since junior high, and she is current president of the University of Calgary Debate Society. Laura has been involved in debate tournaments and public speaking for over a decade. Her focus includes Canadian provincial relations and applications of microeconomics in modern contexts. Now, I want to introduce our moderator tonight. Dwayne Bratt, Chair and Professor in the Department of Policy Studies at Mount Royal University. Educated at University of Windsor, where he received his BA and his MA, and then he received his doctorate at University of Alberta. He teaches in the area of international relations and Canadian public policy, with a specialty in the subfield of Canadian foreign policy. His primary research interest is in the area of Canadian nuclear policy. Recent publications include Canada, the Province, and the Global Nuclear Revival, and co-editor Readings in Canadian Foreign Policy, Classic Debates and New Ideas, second edition. Dwayne is also a regular commentator on political events, and he has moderated other debates for us. We're pleased to have him. And for this evening's debate, he's going to do a brief overview while our debaters get settled in, and giving you a little bit of background before we start a debate. Dwayne Bratt, please.
Good evening, everybody. It's nice to see so many people here. As a political scientist, there's nothing we enjoy more than discussing different forms of electoral systems, and I'm glad that so many other people share that as well. So what I've been asked to do, Elizabeth May is en route from the airport, is just to give some basic information about different forms of electoral systems. There's no discussion about advantages or disadvantages of each system. I will leave that up to the debaters. Instead, it's just an outline of different forms, because there's lots of different forms that are used around the world. And electoral systems matter. And depending on the system, you get a different result, and depending on the system, all sorts of other assumptions around party organization, the number of parties, all of that changes. So I just want to walk through a few slides here. Oops. So the purpose of an electoral system is to produce elected representatives for constituencies, and that could either be a specific riding like we have currently, or it could be a province, or it could be a country. And there's four basic types of electoral systems, although I will say each country puts a different spin on all of them. We have single-member plurality, which is often referred to as first past the post. We have majoritarian systems. We have proportional representation systems. We have mixed member proportionality. So this is just an illustration of some of the different types and just how many different countries choose all of those. Okay. So in single-member plurality, which we have in Canada, the United States, and Britain, people are represented in a single geographic constituency. All you have to do is finish first, which is why they use the term out of horse racing. So it doesn't matter how many candidates there are, all you have to do is finish before anybody else, and then you win, whether you have 60% of the vote, whether you have 40% of the vote. It's a pretty basic, simple to understand system. Majoritarian systems are to ensure that every winning candidate has 50% plus one of the vote. And there's two ways of doing this. One is in a runoff election, and the second is in some form of preferential voting using a single transferable vote or an alternative vote. So in a runoff election, you have a full slate, and it could be 5 candidates, 6 candidates, 7 candidates, and the last place candidate is eliminated. This is the way Canada used to do a lot of its leadership, party leadership conventions. It's also done in France, it's done in Egypt, Ukraine. The state of Louisiana has that. Sometimes you simply drop the low person and then have a second vote, or more commonly, you drop everybody but the top 2 and then they have a runoff, sometimes a week later, sometimes 2 weeks later. And sometimes this is done as in a party leadership convention all in one day, which is why it ends up being a very long day. Or as we've seen in Alberta under the Progressive Conservative Party, historically, it's done a week later and they used 3 candidates that have moved forward. This ensures that the winning candidate has the support of more than 50%. So that's a runoff election. The single transferable vote also tries to also tries to achieve that, but it does that without a second vote. Instead, you mark on your ballot not one check mark, but you rank the ballots. And I always use the example, this is how Heisman Trophy voting goes, is you rank the candidates, and first they count the first place votes, and if nobody gets 50% plus one, then they count the second place votes, third place votes, and so on. This is done in Australia, it's also done in Ireland, and as I said, with Heisman Trophy voting. So that's the single transferable vote. Then we have proportional representation. This is when you have an entire country, let's say Israel, or an entire province like Alberta is one constituency. The ballot only lists parties, not individual candidates, not individual names, just party names. Each party sets up its own party list with as many candidates are to be elected, and so if there are 50 seats available, you have a list of 50, although it's much easier to be number 1 than number 50 on the list, but it's up to parties to determine that. Traditionally, the party leader is number 1, then they work their way down, and each party does things a bit differently. And here it's quite simple. The percentage of the vote equals the percentage of the seats. So if you get 12% of the vote, you get 12% of the seats. Seats are filled top down from each list. Now, some PR systems have it completely free. So if you get 1% of the vote, you get 1 seat. Others say you have to achieve a hurdle. And this is designed to keep out some extremist parties or small parties and say you need 5% of the vote to actually achieve anything. Now, this can get complicated depending on how rounding you go, and that's why you may have a situation where there's only 92% that move forward, and what do you do with the other 8%? As I said, each system is slightly different in that regard. So that's proportional representation. And then the mixed member proportional one is a combination of single member plurality and PR. In this case, you get not 1 vote, but you get 2 votes. You get to vote for a constituency, and that's based on plurality. So think about that first past the post system that I just described. That's your first vote. And your second vote is for a party. In most cases, you may decide, I'm going to vote for party candidate X representing party Y, and then my party list, I'm going to vote for party Y. But some cases you may split your vote. And this is used in Germany, this is used in Japan, Mexico, and New Zealand, where there are 2 votes. And you could either have that party list by province, or you could have that by country. So those are briefly 4 or 5, depending on how you want to count it, different forms of electoral systems. There's a lot out there. This is an important subject because once you change the electoral system, or whichever electoral system you have, changes everything else. It changes party organization, it changes the incentives for voters, the disincentives for voters, and that's why I am pleased that we have got 2 strong debaters with great expertise discussing this, and I can just sit back and listen like the rest of you. Thank you. Are we set to go? Can we put the screen up and? Maybe turn the projector off, if I know how. We have chairs here, they're just trying to lift the screen. So first you have to lift the screen up. And, well, there's water here? There is no water. I know. There's containers. Yes.
Thank you so much for giving me some connections. Excellent.
Not quite two sword lengths, but two desks. So I want to, before I introduce the debaters, I want to just briefly go over the rules. There will be a 10-minute opening statement by each debater, beginning with Ms. Rempel, followed by Ms. May. Then there will be a rebuttal of 10 minutes each, and then as Larry described, there will be questions prepared by the U of C Debate Club's 2 questions for each of our debaters, and then closing arguments of 3 minutes each. So our first debater, and who will be speaking first, is the Honorable Michelle Rempel, who was elected to represent Calgary Nose Hill in 2015 in the House of Commons and Calgary Centre North in 2011. In 2013, Michelle was appointed to the Cabinet as Minister of State for Western Economic Diversification, making her the youngest female appointed to Cabinet in Canadian history. She previously served as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment. In 2015, Michelle was appointed the Official Opposition Critic for Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship. Is there anything going on in that portfolio right about now? No, nothing? Okay. So easy job. Okay. Previously, Michelle was a director at the University of Calgary and built a strong reputation for successfully promoting innovative academic and business research partnerships. She also worked in the Technology Commercialization Division of the University of Manitoba, where she assisted in administering commercialization strategies for a portfolio of over 200 emerging technologies. Michelle has been named one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women by the Women's Executive Network, has also been named one of Avenue Magazine's top 40 under 40, a recognition of Calgary's exceptional community leaders. Michelle has been named twice by Maclean's Magazine as their Parliamentarian of the Year, Rising Star, calling her one of the government's most impressive performers. Michelle's volunteer work has made a difference in Calgary. She has planned events, raised tens of thousands of dollars, and acted a volunteer leader for numerous local not-for-profit organizations, including the Children's Wish Foundation and the Northern Hills Community Association. If you would all welcome Ms. Michelle Rempel. I have to introduce the other debater, Ms. Cox.
I thought you were ready. I'm speaking up for her. I thought that was her moment.
Okay. Sorry.
We didn't rehearse this, obviously.
Yes.
No talking points here.
Yeah. So our second debater is Elizabeth May. Elizabeth May is an environmentalist, writer, activist, lawyer, member of Parliament, and leader of the Green Party of Canada. That's a lot of jobs. Elizabeth became active in the environmental movement in the 1970s. She is a graduate of the Dalhousie Law School and was admitted to the bar in both Nova Scotia and Ontario. She held the position of Associate General Counsel for the Public Interest Advocacy Centre prior to becoming Senior Policy Advisor to the Federal Minister of the Environment from 1986 until 1988. Elizabeth was the Executive Director of the Sierra Club of Canada from 1989 to 2006. She is an officer of the Order of Canada, author of 8 books, was chosen by a vote of all MPs as Maclean Magazine's 2012 Parliamentarian of the Year, 2013 Hardest Working MP, 2014 Best Orator, and by Hill Times as 2013 and 2014 Hardest Working MP and Best Constituency MP. Please welcome Ms. Elizabeth May. If you'll please bear with me here for a moment. There is one additional person I'd like to welcome who is not here with us today. And on Monday, Alberta lost one of its best public servants in Mehmet Mueller, Calgary MLA, in a tragic car accident. If you had an opportunity, there was a great tribute from Mehmet at the Alberta Legislature today. And he will be missed. There's a personal connection. I taught Mehmet at Mount Royal University, and I remember him as a very large 19-year-old, and he's a man that transcends party lines, transcends partisan politics, and I think we should all aspire to that sort of life, and tragically cut way too short. So before we begin, I'd like to have a short moment of silence for Mehmet. Thank you. We'll now begin with the debate, and we'll begin with Ms. Rumpf. And I will be keeping time.
Ish, right?
Time-ish.
Ish, okay, great, because I didn't time the speech, Dwayne.
Okay.
I want to thank the Calgary Public Library as well as CLG and for all of you for coming out tonight. I've been tasked with taking the for side of this resolution. I think it would have been much more fun if we had switched places on that. I'm just saying. And so, you know, I just want to reiterate what was at the start of the debate is I think that we will have a very robust debate about this issue in Parliament as it comes up. So the positions that we're taking tonight, I think, I hope that they're challenged and changed through public dialogue as we as a country talk about democratic reform. All right. If our democracy is to function, it's entirely both the privilege and the responsibility of its actors, the electorate and the representatives of its electorate, to make it so. And at the heart of the debate on reform of our electoral system lies the assumption that our electoral system is broken. In validating this assumption, I think we need to start with the definition of democracy in itself. And for the purposes of this evening, I will use a common definition which states that democracy is a government by the people, a form of government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised directly by them or by their elected agents under a free electoral system. Power by the people, for the people, and of the people. This is you and I, and Elizabeth, of course, and it's our collective responsibility to see the functionality of our democracy. The arguments which are frequently used to validate the assumption that our electoral system is broken assume that these factors impede the electorate and its representatives from full participation or representation in our democracy. So let's go through each of these in brief. So argument number one, our voter turnout is too low, so our electoral system must be broken. The most recent federal election saw the biggest voter turnout in the country in over 20 years. Preliminary results show that 17.5 million voters voted, a turnout of over 68%. On these facts alone, one could argue that given a strong enough reason, the electorate will feel compelled to vote and act on it. And there is evidence that suggests that electoral system in and of itself does not affect voter turnout. Switzerland has a mixed member proportional representation system, and their last election saw 48% voter turnout, which is about the average for them. Ireland uses a single transferable proportional representation voting system, and their voter turnout on average is around the same as Canada under our electoral system. Asking how we inspire the electorate to vote and ensuring that the process enables them to do so is an entirely different process than simply resting on the assumption that our electoral system is broken and that somehow creates low voter turnout. In fact, difficulties for voters to understand the system or for the electoral administration to implement sometimes complex rules or the system of data sets that can be used to argue against a system of proportional representation. Some PR systems are considered to be more difficult than non-PR systems and may require more voter education and training of poll workers to work successfully. Our current electoral system is easy to understand. A voter must need just mark an X beside a single candidate, and the X's are then counted. First past the post is also one of the most familiar electoral systems to Canadian voters. Argument number two, our current system doesn't allow for truly representative governments to be formed. With all of Canada's regional diversity, Atlantic, Quebec, Ontario, Prairies, BC, and North, it's important for representatives to be held accountable to their own constituency and represent their region. Our current system encourages MPs to campaign locally, be involved locally, and push the government to make policies that are in the best interest of their constituents in a national context. The concern with a proportional representation system in a country that is as regionally diverse as Canada is that it may provide the temptation to encourage parties to be more concerned with a national campaign, and local concerns may be drowned out. Unlike PR, our current system results in the representation of all the regions in the country in the governing party. This means that each region will have a voice for it in the government instead of having many smaller parties for each region. And if moderate and centrist governments are a hallmark of Canadian society, our current electoral system lessens the potential impact of extremist parties. In Greece, they have a semi-proportional representation system. Small parties need only reach an electoral threshold of 3% in order to be represented in parliament. This year in Greece's national election, the neo-Nazi party, Golden Dawn, won 7% of the national votes, but got 18 seats in their legislature. This shows that PR systems can sometimes allow extremist parties, which very few citizens support, to get into decision-making roles. This argument is also an oversimplification of the role of electoral systems. An electoral system does more than just count votes. Electoral systems also construct the way parties campaign, run elections, what sort of candidates run and how, the connection to the voter or the candidate, spending limits, constituency sizes, keeping candidates accountable, and the ability for the parties to govern post-election. When we compare the Canadian political system with the American political system, I believe that there was over $6 billion spent in its last presidential campaign. I think we actually have a pretty good system that limits the amount of influence that corporations, NGOs, and any individual can have on our policy deliberations. Members of Parliament have the ability to spend time on policy without being subject to undue influence. When we look at barriers for women running in office, the ability to raise funds is almost brought up. Anything that we can do to level the playing field and eliminate barriers to entry for different demographics who perhaps self-deselect from the political process at a candidate level is a good thing. But this is an entirely different process than tinkering with our electoral system. Argument number 3. There's too much power vested in the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. This statement assumes that there are not checks and balances built into our system of democracy, and I've taken this directly from the Canada 2020 paper on this particular subject. Our own fathers of Confederation, inspired by the British parliamentary system, made 2 important implicit determinations. A strong executive branch was a necessary feature of our parliamentary system, and as such would bring considerable stability to our political system, and our constitutional conventions, the non-written part of our constitution, would be tributaries of key normative pillars for our democracy: the rule of law, constitutional monarchy, judicial independence, federalism, minority rights, and parliamentary sovereignty, and as such would provide necessary checks and balances on the executive. I'm almost done, Dwayne. These conventions have not changed and have been frequently exercised. Depending on the type of PR system, there can be an inability of the voters to enforce accountability by throwing a party out of power or a particular candidate out of office. Under a PR system, it may be very difficult to remove a reasonably sized center party from power. When governments are usually coalitions, some political parties are ever present in the government despite weak or disappointing electoral performances from time to time. The Free Democratic Party in Germany was a member of the governing coalition for all but 8 of the 50 years from 1949 to 1998, and it never gained more than 12% of the vote. Number 4, individuals of Parliament do not have the ability to act independently on behalf of their constituents. There aren't enough free votes in the House of Commons. Talking points are too frequently used. Insert talking point here. Decorum is terrible in question period. We had a supply day motion in the House of Commons that talked about this issue, and I made a few of these points. The Parliament of Canada website states that the chamber of the House of Commons is where members help to make Canada's laws by debating and voting on bills. The chamber is also a place where MPs can put local, regional, or national issues into the spotlight. They represent their constituents' views by presenting petitions, making statements, or asking questions. And in 2012, Speaker Scheer made a ruling stressing that holding governments to account, I took this from a CBC article for quoting purposes, is an indispensable privilege of elected MPs, and reminded the government house that Canada has a parliamentary democracy, not a so-called executive democracy or a so-called administrative democracy. So there we have it. The role of members is to hold the government to account, and indeed the government also has the responsibility to legislate and ensure that the government continues to operate. And how does this work in practice? There are 330 some of us in the House of Commons, and each of us, it's each of our own individual responsibility, and some do this more successfully than others, to execute those duties. And we should all be individually measured by our electorate in our willingness and ability to do so. So we have the responsibility to overcome those things, and we already have the ability to do it. In fact, one of the proudest moments of my political career was when a member of one of the two people sitting on the stage said to me after a vote in the House of Commons, "I changed my vote because of your speech in the House of Commons. If you come prepared and you participate in debate and come with an open mind, you can change the tone." And that's each of our own responsibilities to do that. We're not perfect about that over time, but that ability exists. And finally, argument number 5. I don't feel that my vote counts under the current electoral system. I can't participate in our democracy because of the political party whose platform I support doesn't have more elected representatives. This argument often assumes that a true majority simply equates to 50% of the vote plus 1. I will preface this by saying I did get 60% of the vote in my constituency, but hey, given that there are, in fact, differences in the platform and leadership of each political party, the inability of a candidate to receive the most votes, not even a majority of the votes, in a riding suggests instead that their policies or that they themselves did not resonate with most of the voters, rather than validating the assumption that our electoral system is broken. So this comes down to the question of candidate, their party, and the electorate. We should be focusing on questions of how to inspire the electorate to vote, encouraging their participation in the political process and in the public policy development process, and by extension, shape how candidates and parties approach governing, as opposed to assuming democratic deficits can be remedied simply by changing our electoral system. In our last election, the third party of the House of Commons formed a sizable majority government. This shows that our current system is capable of enabling change when Canadians want it. So, of the people, for the people, and by the people. Our electoral system doesn't govern how we participate in our democracy. We do.
Thank you, Ms. Rempel. We'll now hear from Ms. Elizabeth May.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me, and thanks to the organizers, to Dwayne for getting us going with a lecture that saves the time of trying to, and I think it's probably going to be a few more times over the course of the evening, that one of us tries to explain again, mixed member proportional, single transferable vote. But let me start with, first of all, thanking Michelle for agreeing to do this conversation with me. I'd rather think of it as a conversation, and I pick up her tone entirely from her first opening, that we are about to embark on a national conversation about democratic reform. I'm excited about it. I think it's essential that we change our voting system, and I'll tell you why. But there is no question that now, as a result of the election, there was a very clear commitment made. We may have to remind him many times, but there was a clear commitment made by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in the election campaign that this, the 2015 election, would be the last election held under first past the post. Now, that's good news, but there's a but. We know that we have a couple of options out there. The first thing, of course, is to make sure that Canadians want to get rid of first past the post. I mean, that's an essential part of the democratic reform discussion that we want to have. And I happen to be one of those who says very firmly that the current voting system is broken. I can tell you why. But there are a number of options that, unfortunately, exist that will be congruent with the Prime Minister's commitment to make sure that was the last election under first past the post, but which could also fall well short of proportional representation, which is what many Canadians passionately want, what we believe, and certainly through great groups like Fair Vote Canada, we know from lots of research, lots of data, that governments and parliaments elected by proportional representation have many advantages. There's just empirical knowledge, empirical data, that in governments and parliaments elected under different systems of proportional representation, whether single transferable vote or mixed member proportional, tend to have more women elected, tend to have more people from visible minorities elected, tend to have, and there's some very good data on this, more robust economic performance. also have a greater level of civility in Parliament, and that have just as long periods of good, solid governing. A particularly interesting finding from a lot of research is that you've got parliaments elected with proportional representation voting tend to arrive at policies that meet broad public policy purposes rather than wedge issue purposes. Now, why is that? First past the post as a voting system, and this is an experience that I have had since I got involved in politics. I'm relatively new to politics. I don't like politics much. I think I'd like it a whole lot more if we got rid of first past the post. First past the post informs political parties to want to do to the death any other parties that surround them for fear, particularly if they're near each other on the political spectrum, for fear that their vote might bleed off to another party because they would not be seen as the strategic vote. Or you'd say, well, we've really got to stop so-and-so, and so we're going to have to hold our nose and vote for this other party. The reality of first past the post is that it benefits entirely larger political parties and an agenda of larger political parties to constantly try to winnow out the field to move towards a two-party system. Look at where we have first past the post around the world. And of course, it's the minority of modern democracies that still use first past the post or winner take all. Very obviously, it's the United States, it's the UK, and it's Canada. I'm not counting Zimbabwe. So you've got, and now what are voter turnouts like, and why does it inform it? Well, a two-party system, the US is hardwired as a two-party system. I know, I've got friends in the Green Party of the US. You can't get a presidential candidate name on the ballot except for state-by-state petitioning. It's a very strong two-party system. The UK is much more of a multi-party system, and like us, a Westminster parliamentary democracy. Canada is, I think we're in the throes of trying to decide how we can have a multiplicity of voices in Parliament and not be pushed into a two-party system. But it's very clear to me that the organized power of political parties is behind much of the dysfunction in Parliament. So we could have, in this conversation on democratic reform that Canadians are about to embark upon, we could have a discussion of let's get rid of political parties. Let's start there. And then you'd have every member of Parliament, every candidate standing before their constituents with the fundamental link intact. Because the only definition, the job description for members of Parliament is found in only one place. It's found in the Constitution, and it says members of Parliament represent constituencies. It doesn't say what political parties do because political parties aren't mentioned in our Constitution. By the way, neither is our voting system, which is good news because it means we can very easily pass a bill in the House of Commons that changes our voting system. So what is the worst thing about first past the post? I always used to think that it was the risk of what political scientist, Professor Emeritus Peter Russell has said, which is, he defines it as the false majority. That you can have governments, such as the one we have today and the one we had before October 19th, where 39 to 40% of the electorate can have a landslide win in seats, not in popular support. So Peter Russell has written about this extensively. I recommend his work to you, so I won't dive too deeply into it. But he also argues, as I do, that our system doesn't have checks and balances, that Westminster parliamentary democracy really relies entirely on respect for traditions, on respect for the notion of the supremacy of Parliament. And political parties out for power at all cost can do substantial damage to Westminster parliamentary democracy, and it's particularly dangerous because, as many political scientists have noted, between the US, the UK, and Canada, the Prime Minister of Canada has relatively more power within the context of this country than the President of the United States because the US Constitution really does have checks and balances. It was devised by a bunch of people who were highly worried about abuse of power, having been revolutionaries who got out of being ruled by King George III. Canadians, in contrast, figured, well, we weren't Canada at that point, of course, but the colonies north of the 13 colonies that became the US reflected on King George III. I suppose they figured he's off his head, but he'll be replaced when he dies, and we're fine with Westminster parliamentary democracy and being a constitutional monarchy. That's why the entire graduating class of Harvard in 1776 moved north. We have no checks and balances in our system other than respect for tradition and notions of Westminster parliamentary democracy, supremacy of Parliament, and so on. So what Peter Russell wrote, and I think this is important, he wrote, and he speaks of the dangers of political parties as a culprit in the erosion of parliamentary democracy. It says, in the modern era, a number of factors have combined to make this fusion of powers a real and present danger to the democratic capacity of parliamentary government. First and foremost among these is the emergence of disciplined and well-financed political parties whose leaders employ the techniques of mass advertising to win and retain power. Now you couple the growth of powerful large parties and party discipline, holding every member to account to vote the way they're told to vote, virtually taking the U.S. Congressional College and deciding that that's how you operate from there on. Nobody gets to vote independently or think for themselves. First past the post in this system informs a toxic politic, which says we must never agree with the opposition parties, we must never collaborate, we mustn't show that we're prepared to work across party lines in the interest of Canada or in our constituents. First past the post rewards wedge politics. First past the post encourages nasty politics. Now, in contrast to this, I suppose Michelle's ready to point out that Sunny Ways did get the election result, even without running any attack ads. But we do need to speak clearly about the benefits of moving to proportional representation. Proportional representation will increase voter turnout. They did it in New Zealand, which was just like us, Westminster parliamentary democracy. They've seen more women elected. For the first time ever, Maori MPs. There are a lot of ways in which moving to either mixed member proportional, as in New Zealand, or single transferable vote will encourage people to vote because there are no orphan votes when you move to proportional representation. You don't have the problem of thinking, well, I live in X riding, and you could, you know the story, you could run a goat, but if they were wearing a red shirt, whatever. The point is, we want to know that every vote counts. So, in the 8 seconds I have left, I want to assert very clearly that the system is broken when it's under first past the post. We have a government in power now that says we can move to a system that's fairer. All of us are going to have to inform ourselves more, get engaged with our fellow citizens, which is why I accepted this invitation. This is the launch of the campaign in Canada to get rid of first past the post, hold Justin Trudeau to his word, and push the system to give us really fair voting by proportional representation. Thank you.
Well, I will say one thing about Ms. May. I think she's right that this is not a debate because everybody adhered to the timelines. There was no heckling, and nobody shouted over one another. So it really must be a conversation. So given that it's a conversation and not a debate, there will be no rebuttal. Instead, it'll be the second opportunity to speak as part of the conversation. So, no, you get a second opportunity. We're just not calling it a rebuttal. Because in a conversation, one person speaks, the other person speaks, and so on and so forth. So we'll now hear from Ms. Rempel.
Okay, UFC Debate Club, I'll admit, I haven't done a formal debate since I was 17 years old, so I'm trying to think of all the logical fallacies and things like that, and I don't quite remember all of them, but I'll do my best. Okay, so Elizabeth stated that it's essential that we must change, and that because a majority of Canadians want us to change, then ergo we should change. Now, I'm going to give you my parliamentary and my representative opinion on that. I actually agree with her. I think that if Canadians want a system of electoral reform, it should be something that is taken to the electorate directly. But there's actually a logical fallacy in this, in that when you bring forward something that, when you state that because the public wants it, therefore it's right, that's actually a lapse in logic. So I hope I get some UFC debate points for pointing that one out, just saying. The other thing is, Elizabeth talked about how in proportional representation systems that there are more women elected, a different, more diversity in folks that are elected. Again, I think we have to be careful to ascribe or prescribe causality because of this system. Both of us have been involved in many debates around how to engage more women in politics, and we could have another debate just on that particular issue. But I think saying that an electoral system in and of itself can encourage people who right now may self-deselect from being a candidate is a bit of a leap. It might be part of it, but it's not all of it. And I don't think it's also consistent from country to country, because there might be different reasons, either social inclusion issues or different cultural issues, as to why certain candidates or different groups might self-deselect from running as candidates. So I don't think we can directly ascribe proportional representation to that particular benefit. Elizabeth also raised the issue of broad public policy consensus with a PR system. I would actually argue that our current electoral system ensures stable governments, because under PR systems, it often results in many different parties. And this means that situations can arise where no party will win a majority of the votes, and there will have to be a coalition government. This makes it hard for legislation to pass and can lead to deadlock governments. And we certainly see this in the European Union right now. If this happens, voters could go to the polls much more frequently, which we can debate the benefits of that if you want. I do realize I'm a conservative in this room, but Belgium was elected, in the last election, Belgium elected 13 different parties to their legislature under a PR system, which can make consensus near impossible. This gives small parties a disproportionately large amount of power. Large parties may be forced to form coalitions with much smarter parties, giving powers disproportionate amounts of power based on their percentage of the vote. Elizabeth said, I'd like politics more if we got rid of first past the post. I want to go back to my point, which she didn't rebut, that there is an amount of personal responsibility in how you approach politics. Now, all of you guys can tweet about me and my personal approach to it. But at the end of the day, I am accountable to my electorate, to you, on how I approach politics. It's incumbent upon me under our electoral system to ensure that I'm watching my tone, that I'm coming debate, that I prepared for debate, that I'm listening to my constituents, that I'm knitting those things into some sort of semblance of good public policy. So, I want to temper the argument that if we just change our electoral system, somehow politics will change, because you cannot govern how people behave. We can only do that as a society, and I'm not sure that a change to the electoral system will magically do that. And I think that's a reality that we have to confront. And that leads me to, I'll save that one. Many other countries use proportional representation, therefore we should. There's another logical fallacy in this, and that I don't think that's a fair comparison. Comparing Canada to a small geographic-sized European country that uses proportional representation doesn't recognize the fact that we have different regional priorities in this country and the necessity to weave those regional priorities into a national policy framework. Elizabeth didn't rebut my factual statement on that when we've seen governments formed in Canada, we have in fact had representation for the most part from each different region of the country as part of that government. So when you're sitting around the cabinet table or in caucus and policy is coming forward, that policy is often vetted by somebody from each region, and that's very important in getting that policy balance correctly. Political parties have too much influence. That's another great debate. Calgary Legal Group, let's have that one. But I think that when we assume that PR wouldn't magically fix this, that's also another false assumption. The best way to change a political party is to buy a membership in it and fix it from the inside, or vote against it. I grew up as an activist. I didn't come from wealth or any sort of position of influence. I got involved when I was very young. I learned how to campaign. I became the chair of our party's National Policy Development Committee. And that's the beauty of the Canadian system, is that anybody can get involved and make a difference. So I think that the broader question is, how do we inspire Canadians to get involved in the political system? And then if it doesn't work, run as an independent. If that's something, there's no home for you, you feel you can't change, there is still a way for you to engage in the process. Checks and balances. We have no checks and balances. You said that, Elizabeth, but you didn't rebut my argument. I actually laid out some of the checks and balances that we have. And the judiciary, I would argue, has actually had some pretty serious checks and balances on our legislation, right? We've had some Supreme Court rulings which have directly reflected some of the legislation that our government has passed. So I think to say that there are not checks and balances, and I could spend more time, is a bit of an overstatement. And I'm not sure, again, that the change to a PR system would necessarily fix that. Free votes. All right, Elizabeth. I would just like to say that the Conservative Party of Canada had more free votes. Well, we voted against the government more than any other party in the House of Commons, except for your party, because I don't know if you can vote against yourself. Yeah, there's two, right, good. Okay. So, you said that you never, the system right now makes it such that you can never agree with opposition. I'm going to say that the system right now is such that the media, social media, and our sort of public conscience doesn't want to report on the fact that we occasionally agree with each other. It's the great mystery. We actually talk to each other. I go out for dinner with Elizabeth May. It's going to shock you all. We don't agree about much sometimes, but there's actually a collegiality and camaraderie that exists in the House of Commons. It doesn't exist everywhere. I don't want to make it sound like, it's a wonderful place to be all the time. There's occasional spraying of testosterone. But, I also want to say that, when I was parliamentary secretary to the Minister of the Environment, I had near all-party support to pass a parks bill through the House of Commons that was fairly contentious. Elizabeth actually disagreed with some components of it, surprise. But we actually had a very, very good conversation in committee in the House of Commons and debate around some of the principles of that. We tried to move some of the components of it so it was a more fulsome bill. We worked with provincial governments. I had a unanimously accepted report in my parliamentary committee under a majority government. So again, I want to go back to that argument that it is incumbent upon each of us, be it elected representatives or those who are in the electorate, to participate in the political process and demand better from each of us. And that's my rebuttal.
And Michelle's right, I didn't rebut a lot of what she was saying in the opening because, and I was, let's be very candid about this, I do think that these issues are interwoven with a lot of other threads that are of concern for Canadian democracy. In my last book, I referred to Canadian democracy as being like the Monty Python sketch, The Dead Parrot, nailed to its little perch in hopes that no one would notice. I have been very, very concerned, and the link, and Michelle's quite right to draw your attention back to it. I wasn't saying that changing our voting system would bring us checks and balances. I was saying that a voting system that can deliver a false majority, allowing a prime minister and executive that doesn't have majority public support, powers that exceed those relative to our system of government, that exceed those of either a US president or a UK prime minister. It's a very fascinating thing, and it's been discussed a lot by political scientists, but Donald Savoy is the first to identify it in one of his books, that because in the UK, the caucus can remove the leader, that's why, and we all remember that Margaret Thatcher wasn't defeated at the polls, she was removed by her own Conservative caucus, whereas Canadian parliamentary democracy has for quite a while been absorbing a lot of the presidentialized system south of the border. We've been forgetting that we are not the same as the US, that we are not directly electing a prime minister during an election. So when you have a system where the Prime Minister of Canada in a majority government can do many things that violate our traditions, such as prorogation, because there were no rules to control that before. I think now that we look at the mandate letters to the new cabinet, there is a mandate to the House leader of the Liberal Party, to Dominic LeBlanc, to develop rules and to suggest rules to limit prorogation, to limit access to omnibus budget bills, to try to restore some of the things that, with all respect to Michelle, and she's quite right, we are friends, we like to hang out, and I will defer to Michelle on many things about picking things off a menu. She's really serious about menus. I enjoy my friends in Parliament, but I did not enjoy watching parliamentary democracy treated with contempt over the last 10 years by the previous occupant of the office. And I do believe that because of the vulnerabilities of our democracy, it is incumbent on us to make sure that a majority prime minister in a majority parliament has majority public support. I agree with Michelle, it would be an entire logical fallacy to say if the majority support it, it's right. We've had probably, if you tested how the majority felt about accepting the boatload of Jewish refugees in Halifax Harbor when the St. Louis was there, the majority of Canadians might have agreed with the nameless, thank God for his family and descendants, who said one Jew is too many. The majority can often be quite wrong. But at least, if you're going to have someone with that much power, as a Canadian Prime Minister has in a majority government, let's make sure that there are conditions that put in place a multiplicity of voices and views and representatives, and make sure that every vote counts. Now, getting back to the regionality of first past the post versus proportional representation, and I also want to identify as exceptions to every rule about PR, we would never want to, speaking for the Green Party of Canada, we would never want to go to pure PR as practiced in Israel and Italy. That system, that does create instability. It does create a multiplicity of parties. It doesn't provide for regional balance. But the countries that I would reference, and where we do see very high levels of voter turnout throughout Scandinavia, 80% in Denmark, 85% in Sweden, Norway in the high 70s. These are countries that have had PR for a long time. They're countries with a multiplicity of parties, yes, but they also produce very robust social policies, and there is not any evidence that countries with PR other than Israel and Italy, which are the exceptions because they're pure PR, have less stability in government, have any trouble passing budgets, or any trouble cooperating and working together. So it does create more consensus-based politics and less wedge issue politics. Getting rid of first past the post will be a healthy tonic to create a parliament that actually has the capacity to set aside differences and work together. And while it's true there are a handful of examples in the last parliament where people were able to work together, overwhelmingly the votes were whipped by the three main political parties. And Michelle's right, the Conservatives had fewer whipped votes than the Liberals, and the NDP had all whipped votes. But be that as it may, once you have the ability to work together cooperatively, because you know that when you go into the next election, it's not going to hurt you in the wedge issue politics of, oh, well, the Liberals and the NDP work together on that issue, so as a usual NDP voter, I might just hold my nose and vote Liberal this time. This is, for me, one of the tragedies of the last 10 years, and you may not know of it, it's obvious when you think about it, that the Liberal minority government of Paul Martin was brought down on the opening day of the climate conference, COP11, November 28th, 2005, by what could have been described, but wasn't, strangely enough, as the conservative socialist separatist coalition of the NDP, the Conservatives, and the Bloc, who brought down a minority parliament in order to go to an election, and because of wedge politics, because of the fear of strategic voting, to hold on to that base, the NDP had a campaign that focused exclusively on the Liberal sponsorship scandal in their television ads, because they didn't want people to be thinking, oh, I don't want to have the Conservatives win. They carried out a campaign, and this isn't the first time. The earlier time was the NAFTA election. The same phenomenon occurred. Had we had proportional representation in 1988, the great NAFTA election. Had we had proportional representation in the 2005-2006 election, we would have had a parliament that reflected where Canadians really were. And we would have had conditions after the election which would not have penalized political party leaders who are closer to each other on the spectrum, in this case the NDP and the Liberals, but in previous examples we could have pointed out Reform and Progressive Conservative. If you're not worried about losing your vote to a party that's close to you on the political spectrum, there's a much greater likelihood that you will work together. What does that have to do with electing more women? Back to this point. It's not about the electoral system that gets more women elected. It's about the culture of politics itself that makes more women feel, I can see myself doing that. And I think Michelle will agree with me that our best moments in Parliament were when we were able to find common ground on anything, when we were able to have respectful discourse without rampant heckling and really unpleasant behavior. The House of Commons is the only workplace in Canada where there is no code that says you can't bully. The bullies are celebrated because they're being effective in politics. And again, I agree with Michelle that the media has a big role in this, in not pointing out when we actually are able to accomplish things and only in focusing on the worst. But the reality of it is, Canadians want to be able to watch Question Period with their children. And not feel that it's important to change the channel lest their children develop bad habits. And what you see on television isn't nearly as bad as when you go in person. And I don't want to again see school groups hustled out by their teachers who don't want to be watching what's going on below. I want Parliament to be a celebration of respectful discourse, of a democracy that makes Canadians proud to watch their MP at work, and that brings school kids into the process, that increases voter turnout, that over the next period of time, we can have a Canadian democracy which serves the interests of all Canadians, so that we can actually address issues that matter instead of being distracted in things as foolish as whether a woman can wear a niqab for a citizenship ceremony, or there's another extreme I'm sure I could think of. We need to be able to do the work of the people of Canada for the very laudable, and I love them, how boring our goals were in the British North America Act. But it's worth remembering that while the U.S. founders were busy chasing after life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all we want is peace, order, and good government.
We have the list of questions.
City of 1.5 million, you make up the
This is
budget.
for Michelle Raffel.
People
Okay.
make the budget over a year-long process. That's what real democracy looks like.
Okay, first question for Ms. Rempel. What are the specific changes you would suggest to solve electoral issues such as low voter turnout, minority representation, if not electoral reform?
I'm actually really passionate on this particular question because I think we have the tools right now in order to do that. I was going to save this for part of my closing statement, but when we look, let's talk about women in politics for a minute. The aggressive nature of politics is sometimes cited as a reason why women don't get involved. But I take offense to the word aggressive. I'm not aggressive, I'm competent. You might not like what I have to say, but you know I'm making a point, right? That doesn't make me wrong, and it doesn't make me a bully, and it doesn't make me somehow less of somebody, because if I was a male, I think you'd call me innovative or assertive. So I think it's more on that point, us as a culture, on accepting women who have voices, regardless of political ideology, and allow them the stage without gendered assumptions. You can't fix that through an electoral system. We fix that by doing stuff like this. The second component on women is it's all about the nomination, baby, 100%. And in a PR system, it would be how do you get on that party list? In safe seats or getting high up on a party list, you have to know how to work in your party system, inspire the confidence of your members or people in your community to ensure that you can have that nomination. And we don't teach enough women or different groups on how to do that. In fact, nobody teaches anybody on how to do that. That's the deep, dark secret of politics, is that if you want to run for office in what's considered a safe seat, you better work your buns off, because that is the way that you're getting on there. So for me, I think it's a broader conversation for women. It's Equal Voice is very vocal on this. They're talking about how do women learn how to win political nominations for any political party. It doesn't matter if there's a quota system in there or not. Women should be shown how to win party nominations. Now, it's not just about showing how to do that, because there's often social inclusion issues or reasons why women aren't positioned to win nominations, right? If you're a primary caregiver, it's very difficult to do the networking that is needed to build a broad base of support in order to sell party memberships. If you're coming from if you've got income challenges, or if you're coming from a lower income, you might not have the fundraising capacity to get babysitting and all of these sorts of things to do it. The realities that women face when looking at politics. And that's a broader conversation than an electoral system. It's a way broader conversation, but it's one that we need to have. And that's, you asked me how. I sort of got on my soapbox there. Number one is identifying that it's not something we can just gloss over, that we have to be very active about within each of our own political parties, but through groups like Equal Voice. I think supporting groups like those is very important, but it's also important to enable programs and services to do that. To me, the democratic deficit that is often talked about by groups like Canada 2020, things that I see come through my office and whatnot, what would I do? It's my responsibility as an elected official. I spoke to this in the House of Commons. It's my responsibility to inspire people to be involved in the political process, even if it means being vehemently opposed to something, because at least you're participating, right? Do you know what I mean? So the way that I've personally conducted myself is I have a really broad-based, quite eclectic, very eclectic political organization in my home riding. I try to do events like this. I try to use my platform to inspire Canadians. You might not like what I have to say, but I'm trying to get you engaged. So in turn, I think the electorate, we have to make sure that the electorate is inspired to participate as well, too. And, have we been perfect in that? No, absolutely not. But going forward, as someone who's young in their career, I hope that that's something that becomes a nonpartisan activity, that more people, I think, what is it, Elizabeth, something like 2% of Canadians hold a political party membership in Canada? Or less? That's crazy, right? When you think about it, if Elizabeth talked about sort of wanting to vote for somebody but not quite sure. A lot of that is because you could actually buy a political party membership, attend a political party conference, and change the governance of a party or change the party's policy. That's a lot of work, right? Takes a lot of time. You might not have that time. Right? So it's incumbent upon us to look at things within our political party structure, within how we engage Canadians right now in that. So it's not this black box. I wonder how many of you actually, how many people in this room, now I'm assuming many of you are very politically active, actually know how to win a nomination, like how the process of getting your name on that ballot works. Not a lot, right? So, to me, that's a very important thing to do. So in response to you, I think that we will have a very fulsome debate on this over the next 4 years. I hope so, in terms of electoral system reform. But we have to separate out electoral system reform from the ability and the conversation around how do we engage as Canadians in our democracy in a more fulsome way.
Okay, the first question for Ms. May is, how would you address individual accountability with a proportional representation system?
These are great questions because they let us get to the fact that proportional representation is a really nuanced thing, and there are lots of different systems, and we could cook up our own system just for Canada. There are many variations among the different proportional representation systems around the world. So in terms of accountability, if you're talking about mixed member proportional, the MPs elected per riding, just the way we are now with that one vote. You heard Dwayne saying earlier, you get the 2 votes. You have 1 vote for your MP in your riding. It's just like now. Your second vote is where you think you'd like to see the party land. Which party do you want to make sure gets balanced out in Parliament? If you consider that what we have now, so even if you just have 1 vote, it still works. You vote the way you want, you have an MP for your riding with a local connection. And I do think the local connection to constituents and constituencies is essential. So you represent your riding, but then you don't even necessarily have to do the 2 vote route. You could we could say, okay, well, in this last election, 40% voted Liberal, so they shouldn't have the majority of the seats. We rebalance that out. Who got fewer seats than the proportionality? Now, you don't need to go to the list system that Michelle mentioned. I also have a problem with the list system because it can allow people in political parties to keep up the same old people being put at the top of a list. Do you understand why I'm talking about a list? Is once you've elected your House of Commons, and you know who your MPs are because they're attached to your constituency, there's a group of at-large seats held to the side to be filled in to rebalance the Parliament so it will reflect the popular vote. Where do you get those MPs to sit at-large to rebalance? Well, it could just be that you say, okay, the Conservatives should have had a few more seats this time, or the NDP should have had a lot more seats this time. Let's go to those people in that party who finished second across the board till we have a group that can fill in the at-large seats. So the accountability for those who are elected, as we now do, representing their constituents, is unchanged. The accountability is built in. The accountability for the performance of the party will affect the votes for those who are elected at large. And of course, those people, if they come from those who have been nominated and run in a riding and want to continue to represent that riding, but come in second, and then that's how you get them on in the Parliament. I think it's a very good system to eliminate the lists and be more creative about it. Accountability is just like now. There's going to be an election. And the power of political parties the reduction of the power of political parties does, I think, come about through more respect in Parliament, more ability to work across party lines, because the worst part of Parliament, when it's run strictly on party lines, is that it kills good ideas and squelches the opportunity to work together, because no matter how much Michelle may want to find 1 or 2 examples in the last 4 years where that didn't happen, that's been the vast majority of times that we have had unified block voting party by party, and it does not assist getting good public policy, which by definition should involve compromise, should involve being able to listen to someone else and say, okay, I like your idea better. Why don't we do that? So the accountability is always at the polls, responsible to your constituents. But the work we do together should be for the benefit of the people of Canada. And once an election is over, the work we do should not be dictated by the spin doctors and political strategists who are sitting in a back room somewhere, never running for office themselves, but deciding this issue is a winner for us in the next election. So let's push like hell on Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act. That drove me nuts.
Okay, question number 2 for Ms. Rempel. Other electoral systems can also be for the people, by the people, and of the people. What specifically makes first past the post better?
Well, I stated some of the points in my opening remarks. Certainly I think in a broad geography like Canada, first past the post allows each region to ensure that there's a voice within their cabinet, within a government's cabinet, as well as in their caucus room. Caucus rooms are, we meet once a week, we discuss upcoming policy and whatnot. It's vetted through members of parliament. It's the stuff that you actually don't see on the media, so that's a very important consideration. I think that first past the post also, as I said, it reduces the possibility of extremists, and I'm talking extremists. I gave the example of the party in Greece, parties that have a very, very small percentage of support within the public from gaining power wherein they actually have to be negotiated with to secure government or secure the passage of the bill. I think that with first past the post, because of that, there is some benefit to having clarity in terms of the person that you're electing, understanding what their political platform is and what you can expect when they are elected in government. As much as, Elizabeth has given examples of policy that might not be popular with you that we passed as a government, we did receive a majority mandate in 2011 to pass most of the bills that we did. So the question becomes, I know the grumbling, but I'm saying the point that I'm trying to make is that we were transparent in what that political platform was, right? Oh, you guys. I think first past the post too, there was quite a bit of debate in the House of Commons around voter identification requirements. That was a big debate that we had this year, right? And one of the arguments for not requiring voter identification was to ensure that there was ease of voting for people coming to the polls. If you're going to carry that argument forward, first past the post is a very easy system of government for people to participate in going to the polls, and certainly as well for people who are managing the voting process, like our Elections Canada's officials, to participate in. There's many examples in European countries where the entire arm of the administrative body that essentially our Elections Canada counterparts. It's a very complicated system sometimes to manage. Now, Elizabeth did say there's different forms of PR. Certainly, some would be easier to administer than others, but I think because Canadians are very familiar with this system, and I think there's only been a couple examples in the history of our country, even at provincial levels, where other systems have been dabbled with. I think it was 1920s through the 1950s. There were some examples in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, I think, of single transferable vote being used for a period of time, but Canadians are very familiar with that. And again, I would just, and I can put some of this through in my closing statements, but nothing I've heard tonight shows that our electoral system is the causation of any sort of democratic deficit in the country. No, seriously, no. If we're going to have this is something you might go, oh, but then rebut some of my points, right? We're here to debate, and I think if we are going to change our electoral system, and the reason is because it's a causation of democratic deficit, then let's be sure that that causation is actually there. And I haven't heard anything yet tonight that has linked that to, and that's what I'm going to form some of my closing statements around. So, I'm trying to argue on the for side of this. I do think that we're going to have a very interesting conversation as Canadians. And as a legislator, it's my job to listen to my constituents and understand where they're at in terms of that understanding, to debate this in the House of Commons, and I'm quite looking forward to that. But I also think that as a country, we have to be very careful that we're not going into this into this conversation with assumptions one way or the other, that the electoral system in and of itself is the cause or the magic bullet to some of those issues with regard to democratic deficit that we've been talking about tonight.
Okay, and the second question for Ms. May is, how would you deal with consensus-based issues of giving more power to minority parties?
You know, I've been remiss in not mentioning one thing, and I hope you forgive me when I was partly responding to what Michelle was talking about, but I think it will be instructive for Canadians as we go through this process of discussing the democratic deficit and a change to our electoral system to look at what happened in New Zealand, because I mentioned earlier that they changed. It was a very big change for a Westminster parliamentary democracy to decide to leave first past the post and adopt the German system of mixed member proportional. They did that in about mid-1990s. Just last year, they had another referendum to say, do you want to go back to first past the post or do you like what we have? And they overwhelmingly kept mixed member proportional. And it has resulted in a more consensus-based decision-making. So to smaller parties, when you are accommodating a range of interests, and I don't dismiss out of hand Michelle's point that some right-wing extremist parties can find a foothold with mixed member proportional or with proportional representation. But overwhelmingly, the majority view of the majority of voters and how they voted is what will make up the House of Commons or the Parliament. And there are very often formal coalitions or informal coalitions. Right now, all the parties in Sweden, including the Greens, are right now in a coalition in Sweden. I'm looking forward to seeing my friend Åsa Romson, who's Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden, who's also their lead climate negotiator, next week when we get to COP21. But in that grouping, they actually all banded together to say, we must hold firm and make sure that we protect democratic rights so that there is an ultra right-wing neo-Nazi party that's gotten some votes. They say, okay, we're going to work together as a larger group of parties to make sure a dangerous and extremist party that offends our values doesn't have procedural rights that can expand its reach. So there are ways in the cooperation can reach quite far left and right to say, wait a minute, that's an extreme party that represents a threat to our values, and we will cooperate to make sure that they don't benefit from loopholes that could give them additional funding. It's about funding right now in Sweden. So there are ways to cope with this and to come to consensus decision-making. Consensus decision-making isn't easy. It's how the Green Party is run. As leader of the Green Party, my job description is actually to be the chief spokesperson for the party. And the party is run by a large committee of people elected from across the country who are all volunteers. And our meetings are run by consensus. I can definitely share with you, if you don't already know, consensus decision-making is a lot harder. But it's more satisfying in the end because you've actually achieved a result where everybody gave a little. And that's why the empirical research, which you can find on Fair Vote Canada's website, quite interesting research from Harvard and from Yale, looking at hundreds of elections in dozens of countries, that the countries that have PR are much more likely, when examined, to have policies that represent a broad public consensus and not skewed to one interest group.
Okay, so that closes the question and answer period. We'll now hear concluding statements, 3 minutes each-ish. And we'll start with Ms. Rempel.
So the question tonight was, should we change? It was related to should we change our system, our electoral system in this country. You know, I was tasked with talking on the side that our current system is fine, it's working pretty well. Elizabeth was tasked with talking towards change. What is interesting, what happened tonight though, and what you saw, was that the discussion around whether we should change our electoral system went into a discussion on how do we reduce democratic deficit in this country. And I firmly believe that we have to a certain extent, in order to achieve that end goal, separate those conversations out. Because if we go into a conversation around electoral system reform, thinking that all of those things will change overnight because we change our system, our electoral system, I think we're going to be sadly underwhelmed and disappointed. And I think we've actually done a disservice to all of us, regardless of political stripe, as Canadians. And so I'm going to go through very quickly a few points that have come up since my opening statements. You know, the whole conversation around American-style politics and the installation and the power being centered in a prime minister and a leader. First of all, I think we could have an entire conversation around whether or not fixed election dates inspire a more American style of politics. I just went through an 80-day campaign. That was awesome. You know, I think that when we talk about American-style politics and that installation of power, what about fundraising? I can tell you one of the greatest blessings that I have in my career as a Canadian politician is that I don't spend half my day fundraising. And when I go into the House of Commons to vote, I'm not beholden to a special interest because we've determined the materiality of influence on a politician in this country as a $1,500 personal donation. And corporations aren't coming into my office to lobby me with large piles of money where I'm beholden to them. And I sound a little glib there, but that's a big difference between us and the American style. And I think that because we have a lot of stuff just in terms of our financial accountability and those sort of electoral financing systems, we're actually set up for success there in a pretty good system. Elizabeth made a lot of points tonight about how proportional representation would inspire more cooperation in government. But a lot of those arguments are sort of predicated on the fact that there would be more minority parliaments, and then therefore everybody would have to work together to get things done. I think we should just rewind back in history to the period of time where we did have minority parliaments in Canada. I'm not sure that you could take out of that a minority government actually made Parliament more functional. There wasn't a lot of legislation that got passed. So I'm not sure that a minority Parliament in and of itself forces cooperation. Again, I think that goes back to how individual parliamentarians conduct themselves. And you know what? You as the electorate sense that. You sense when we're being adversarial for the sake of being adversarial, or when we're not being genuine in our role to use power to affect public change. You guys vote based on that. So I don't think that we can ascribe that a proportional representation system would necessarily change that culture in Canada, because I think another thing that's worth talking about is that we consume information differently than we did 5 years ago even 5 years ago, right? We're consuming information right now in 140 characters. You know what? I love engaging in Twitter. I love that. But you know what I don't love? When the debate devolves down to, yeah, Rempel, go home. Do you know what I mean? And Elizabeth made a very good point too, in that I do find that sometimes when I'm engaging in interviews and whatnot, the story becomes more sensational afterwards. And that's what I worry about. We're not there yet, and I have many colleagues in the media that are awesome, they work really hard, but because we now communicate in sound bites, right? It's difficult for me to walk through, I don't get the time on TV or whatnot to explain, where I'm at on an economic policy or whatnot. So how do we engage in a public policy debate that's not devolve down into good versus evil, or sort of, that really partisan sort of thing? I don't necessarily have the answer to that, but I think we all as a group have to talk about that too. And I'm not sure, and I haven't heard anything tonight that says that a change in electoral reform is fundamentally going to change that, right? So I guess there's a few other things I could talk about too. Elizabeth, I'll just let you take the last word, I guess. But, I want to leave you with that. I want to leave you with that from a very, I hope you're sensing the authenticity and nonpartisanship in this tone. That even if we approach electoral system reform fine. But let's do that knowing that there's a broader suite of issues and that we can't attribute causation to every piece of democratic deficit that has been talked about in Canada to our electoral system. How we fix everything else, well, that's a worthy conversation. That's interesting. That's difficult. There's personal ownership on all sides involved in that. But that's how I'd rebut this debate. I'm not sure that our system is broken enough, that the electoral system itself is the cause of that. And that's why I support our current electoral system. In the context of this debate, hashtag disclaimer, see you in Parliament.
Thank you. And now we'll have the closing statement from Ms. May.
I want to thank Michelle Rempel for doing this with me. I think it's really a good start to a conversation which we'll be having about democratic reform. And maybe I can convince her the system is broken by telling you the following. There is no question that we can't hold out proportional representation as a panacea that will automatically restore Westminster parliamentary democracy and the fundamental principles of the supremacy of Parliament, nor will it guarantee that 85% of Canadians will vote. But it will guarantee one thing. It'll guarantee that any Prime Minister and Cabinet governing in this country was elected by the majority of people who voted. We will never again have a false majority because only one system of voting anywhere in the world allows a party that does not have the support of the majority to govern with the majority of seats. Only one. And it is first past the post. And eliminating winner take all will then allow us to be sure that Canadians no longer feel as though there's no point voting where I live because we all know the results of the election before it happens. Now, I do think that we can celebrate quite a lot of things, and I will refer back to the last really great minority parliament in Canada, because it's worth remembering cooperation did occur, and I think it occurred specifically because we had not yet seen such a presidentializing of the Prime Minister's role. The presidentializing of the Prime Minister's role actually started in 1970 under Pierre Trudeau with the creation of the Prime Minister's office. It didn't exist before. Under Lester B. Pearson, it was, as he recounted by Tom Kent, his principal secretary, it was a handful of file clerks and stenographers. It's interesting that Justin Trudeau is the first Prime Minister since Lester B. Pearson to recognize that being Prime Minister isn't a full-time job. Most Prime Ministers of Canada through our history were Prime Minister, which meant basically chairing the cabinet table, but also kept other portfolios for themselves, often Minister of Justice or head of the Treasury Board. Justin Trudeau has kept for himself Intergovernmental Affairs and Minister for Youth. Interesting. First Prime Minister since Lester B. Pearson who kept for himself Foreign Affairs. The minority parliament of Lester B. Pearson, with strong opposition from John Diefenbaker, with a rump group of NDP members of parliament led by Tommy Douglas, delivered the following things to Canada: our healthcare system, the Canada Pension Plan, unemployment insurance, student loans that didn't bear interest, and the flag. And the flag debate is a great one to look back at because the Conservatives didn't whip the vote, and a bunch of Conservatives finally said, enough with the debate, let's just do the flag. Let's celebrate those things that are good about our current electoral result. I think it's brilliant that 69% of Canadians voted, but I wish it was 85. Some ridings, my riding had the 5th highest voter turnout in Canada. I'm thrilled about that, 79.5% voter turnout. But voter turnout does have a lot to do with the efficacy of the vote. And a vote that counts is a vote that's effective, and that's why getting rid of first past the post will bring up voter turnout. I also agree with Michelle, we have excellent financing rules in Canada. In politics, we don't have to spend all our time raising money, and we don't spend $6 billion in every election. And I want to celebrate as well that our Minister of Democratic Reform, I don't know how many of you have looked at who all the cabinet members are. Our Minister of Democratic Reform is, like Michelle, a young woman in politics. Her name is Mariam Monsef. She's the new Member of Parliament for Peterborough. She was 11 years old when she came to Canada as an Afghanistani refugee with her widowed mother and sisters. I think it is going to be very interesting for Canadians to work through the process of democratic reform, and if we believe, and it will be a lot of holding feet to fire and pushing, that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau wants to restore the principles of cabinet government, then Mariam Monsef and the consultations she runs will really matter. We really do have an opportunity to influence the course of electoral reform and fixing the democratic deficit in Canada. It's already started. If you haven't done it already, go to the Prime Minister's Office website and read the open letters of mandate to the ministers. Read the letter to Mariam Monsef and write back to her right away and say, when and where and how do I get involved so that we can fix our electoral system? Offer yourselves up right now as citizen volunteers for the movement to ensure that 2015 is our last unfair election. Thank you.
Well, I was going to say that we should be thanking our debaters, but I think you've just, I'm hoping, done that for both of them.
No.
No, that was just me? Okay. And let's hear from Ms. Rempel. And in the spirit of consensus building, I think one of the themes that both of them agreed on is that this is going to be a 3.5, 4-year conversation about electoral reform, and I'm hoping that that is very good for this country, whatever decision that we come up with. In addition, our two debaters will go out to the lobby, meet with some of you, where you can ask some additional questions. I know I had a whole bunch of questions that weren't asked, but I will leave those for now. And now I'll ask Larry to end this part of the debate.
I'll have Jerry join me as well here. First of all, a couple words from the library.
I just want to say again, thank you so much to our debaters for a really, really engrossing conversation tonight. Thank you both. And Dwayne, I really want to tip my hat to you and say thank you for moderating tonight's.
But I couldn't ask any questions.
Well, and I also want to thank very much Calgary Legal Guidance for arranging the speakers tonight and just for the many wonderful things that we do in collaboration together. So, Larry. And in closing, I just want to encourage, if you enjoyed tonight's conversation, we have one more debate coming up in January. Our theme is Tough on Crime, and the Tough on Crime agenda is unfair to the poor and the disadvantaged. We'll be debating this Wednesday, January the 27th, and we hope we have as big a turnout as we do tonight. If you enjoyed tonight's debate, and if you enjoyed the Going to Pot debate in October, then I hope we'll see you all out here. And again, thank you very much.
So just for your information, before we go to the lobby, we're going to take a few pictures up on the stage. So you can free to take pictures at that time while we do this. I want to again thank the University of Calgary Debate Club for helping us out and participating. Thank you very much. And it can't be a fun event like this if you don't hand out something that they can all drink. So on behalf of Calgary Legal Guidance and the library, I want to thank our participants. Dwayne, thank you very much. Ms. Rempel, it was wonderful of you to jump in and participate in this debate. We know that we had Ms. May sign up for this debate, and it was great to have you. I really appreciate that. You can't have a great debate without great debaters, and she did a wonderful job. Thank you. And Miss May, who flew in today, squeezed this into her agenda. She has to head right back tomorrow, back to her riding before she heads off to Paris. I want to, it's wonderful that she came, as also being a part-time Salt Spring Island resident. You are, and I appreciate it very much. This all started on Canada Day when I stuck an extra piece of cake, and just so I could talk to her, I forced myself to eat 2 pieces. Anyway, so thank you for flying all the way in, joining us tonight. Thank you very much, Ms. May. Thank you. So now we'll do our pictures, and we'll see you in the lobby in a few minutes. Thank you very much, everyone.